recognized the importance of Sekhukhune in the wars of resistance. They already spoke about him as a great dread to the English colonists. And why was he a great dread to the English colonists? It was because, although we remember a lot about the frontier wars of the Eastern Cape, and although we remember a lot about the annexation of the Zulus, and we remember King Sekhukhune, and we remember King Sekhukhune, we have forgotten about King Sekhukhune. But only 136 years ago, this was a different place. This was a different terrain, a different territory. It was the combination of the British and the Boers, the Afrikaners, that ultimately led to the defeat of Sekhukhune. But we also remember him not only because of the heroic wars that he fought against conquest, but we also remember him as somebody who was interested in the unification. Indeed, those of you who remember history will recall that what ultimately led to his defeat was a division amongst the Pedi people and the Swazi people. And it was a division within the Pedi people themselves. Those who have forgotten history must remember that King Sekhukhune was killed on the 13th of August 1882. They will also remember that he was not killed by the British. He was not killed by the Boers, but he died in the hands of one of his own. He died in the hands of his own blood. Indeed, he died in the hands of the Pedis themselves. How did this happen? We must remember the wars of resistance that begin with the arrival of the four trekkers led by Hendrik Potgieter. When they arrived here where we are today, it was Sekhukhune's father, Sekwati, who resisted them. The famous battle of Piring that was fought in 1838. Sekwati actually defeated the four trekkers. And what he did was to use the impenetrable hill, you know, the hills around us. And he ultimately moved to the new headquarters, Tabambosika. And it was called at the time the Fighting Kopi. And this was in the Lulu Mountains, where ultimately the last war of in December 1879 was left with Sekwati having conquered. Much later, a German missionary, Merensky, who was a superintendent from the Berlin Missionary Society, expelled because of his subversive activities, arrived in the land of the Pedis, and he was to take refuge in Botshabelo near Middelburg, where he established a mission station and a school. This is important because it shows us something else about the wars of resistance, that they were not only about war, they were also about the conversion of people into ways of Europe. And the ways of Europe included Christianity, and they included the idea of converting native people or Africans into Christians. But the idea of converting native people into Christians was part and parcel of the colonial project itself. In this part of the world, we remember Merensky as having been a particularly effective instrument in the conversion of the Pedi people into Christianity. But he was not doing it because Christianity was a good thing for the Pedi people. He was doing it in order to lay the foundation for colonial conquest. Much later, in 1877, it was Theophilus Shapston, and Theophilus Shapston, you will remember, was a British colonial instrument who had annexed Natal. On the 12th of April 1877, Theophilus Shapston announced the annexation of the Transvaal. And he claimed that the problem was that the Boers had pacified the Bapedi, and that pacification threatened the independence and the existence of the British. But everyone who knew anything about history knew that this was a pretense. There had been no pacification. But it was Sekhukhune who rejected the annexation, because his view was that his empire, the empire of the Pedis, fell outside the jurisdiction of Pretoria, which was the land of the Boers, and that the land between the Vaal and the Limpopo rivers belonged to the Pedi people. And he vowed that he would never accept Boer rule. And although he could accept the status of a protectorate, but he would never accept the control by the British. So this was the seed of the very first war. It was an explicit rejection by Sekhukhune of a decision taken by Theophilus Shapston to annex the land of the Bapedi and to include it under Pretoria, when at the time the entire Transvaal was meant to be one of the British territories. In March 1878, the drums of war were already beating again. But this time, unlike the earlier wars, these would be fought against the British. The British sent a captain called Captain Clark to subdue Sekhukhune. But for the second time, Sekhukhune routed Clark. And it was with a heavy loss that ultimately the British succumbed. But shortly after the 1878 war, the British reinforced. They brought more men. And between August and October 1878, they tried to reduce Sekhukhune into submission. But the mission again failed. And in October the 6th, 1878, the British retreated. So by this time, we have two general, Sekhukhune himself and his people, resisting colonial conquest. The following year, in July 1879, the British made a third attempt. But that attempt had failed again. You will remember 1879 as important not only for the area today we call Sekhukhune land, but important also in the Eastern Cape, where the British were again engaged in another war over the Xhosa-speaking people. Imfazwe kanca yechibi. Ngimbonile uTata uMathanzima uba ulapha. Uyakuyikhumbula ke lo mfazwe. But they were also involved in another war in Zululand against Cetshwayo, and they were not able to reinforce their army over the land of Sekhukhune. And the third war also ended in failure by the British. It was only with the last attempt of December 1879 that the British were ultimately able to conquer Sekhukhune after 4 attempts. And how did they do this? They did it by enlisting about approximately 10,000 Swazi troops into the army of the British. And these were recruited and put under the instructions of a Captain MacLeod, who was at the time the British political agent in Swaziland. They engaged in a surprise attack against Sekhukhune's men. Sekhukhune took refuge in a mountain called the Lulu Mountain, which is approximately 20 kilometers from Thaba Mosika. And he was cut off from the sources of food and water. And so, in December, on the 2nd of December 1879, Captain Clark and Commandant Ferreira, they were able to put the cave under a siege, and they called Sekhukhune out. He had no choice but to comply. When they called him out, he was accompanied by his wife and his children, his half-brother, including Mphahle, who was a national of the Swazis, and a few of his men. Commandant Ferreira had this obsession that Sekhukhune owned gold and diamonds. They searched the caves, but they found nothing. And so the fourth of the colonial wars came to an end. On the 9th of December 1879, Sekhukhune, his wife, and his supporters were sent to prison in Pretoria. They remained in prison until the Pretoria Convention of the 3rd of August 1881 is referred to as the South African War. And as we know, the end of that war between the British and the Boers was to carve out what we today call the Transvaal for the control of the British and the Boers to the exclusion of the native people. What happened to Sekhukhune is that he could not return to Thaba Mosega because the mountain anyway and the villages had been burnt down in war. And he was then banished into Manoche. Come back to where I began. On the 13th of August 1882, Sekhukhune was murdered by his half-brother, Mampuru. And there had been an old dispute among historians about the death of Sekhukhune. But it is largely a settled fact that the death came as a consequence of Mampuru in relation to an internal fight about the lawful kingdom into Sekwati's heirs. But we now know that after 4 wars of conquest, the Pedi people were ultimately subdued. This, unfortunately, is the way in which the land of the Pedis fell under the control of the Boers and the British. This is the same as the land of the Xhosas, the same as the land of the Zulus, the same as the land of the Sothos. When we today talk about the land question, we must remember the basic facts of history. Today, people tell us that when the Boers traveled from the Cape after 1834, fleeing from the consequences of the abolishment of slavery, what they found in the interior was what is called terra nullius, a vacant piece of land. There were no people as they went along, and that is how they were able to set their establishment. It is the old myth, it is the old lie, told over and over again by Afrikaner historians. It is surprising that in 2018, the same lie is still being repeated over and over again as justification for colonial conquest. Today, it is a great privilege for me personally that I come to speak on an occasion such as this, because I believe that if we are to take seriously the question of the return of the land of native people, we have to speak the truth about how the land was lost, how the land was taken. And if the message that the land is ours is to have any resonance among black people in this country, it must be grounded on the correct set of facts, on the correct historical fact. When I drove this morning coming through to this village, it struck me how many places I had read about in history that are today carved up into farmland that only 130 years ago were occupied by black people peacefully without disturbance. Of course, this may sound like a radical statement, but I make no radical claims because luckily I'm not a politician. I simply make historical claims that if you had come to this area only 150 years ago, the fact is this land would unquestionably, all of it, unquestionably have belonged to the petty people without disruption. But if you came to this land, I'm not saying it belongs to them now, I'm saying it belonged to them 150 years ago. So I know that people like hearing the statement. I'm saying that if you reversed, it's a hypothetical point. Don't want people to say that I said they must now chase the white people away. The hypothetical point is if you came here 150 years ago, all of this area would have unquestionably belonged to the petty people. No doubt about that. So, how do we then reverse the facts of history? My point is that we can never reverse the facts of history, but we must never forget the facts of history. We must never forget that it was a combination of trickery, hypocrisy, and war that ultimately led to the loss of the land. But we cannot follow the same path as the people that conquered us, because the struggle for freedom, which is not a struggle, by the way, that began in 1912 when the ANC was formed, because we know that the struggle was ferocious in this area during the life of Sekhukhune. The struggle against colonialism was a struggle also based on the immorality of colonial conquest. What black people were fighting against was not just the physical taking of the land. They were also fighting against the immorality of the system. They believed that the system was morally bankrupt. They believed that the idea of a few white men coming from Europe to take over the land was an immoral system. And so, they did not just want to replace white people with black people. They also wanted to replace the white system with a moral system. Right? And this is so important, we must never forget it, that in part and parcel of the struggle against colonial conquest was a struggle also for the restoration of black humanity. In my own language, we call it Ubuntu. I believe in yours, you call it Butu. This was at the heart of the struggle to resist colonial conquest. The idea was that when we are free, freedom will not only be enjoyed by us, but it will be enjoyed by all. But what is this freedom I talk about? It was always envisaged that freedom would not be complete until the question of land is resolved. In other words, there would be no freedom among black people if that freedom is not accompanied by the return of what was originally taken. I know that politicians like talking about stolen land, as if people were sleeping and then the British then came overnight and stole the land. The land was not stolen, it was taken by force. We must always remember that black people were not sleeping, they were fighting. But from 1912, the ANC's formation was so important to consolidate the struggles of black people, because what it did, unlike the wars that had been fought in the late 19th century, the war of the early 20th century was a different war because it was a non-tribal war. What the ANC was able to achieve was the unification of black people into Africans, and no longer the Pedis, no longer the Zulus, no longer the Xhosas, no longer the Swatis, but Africans. So the struggle was always the struggle about unity. It was to first unify black people, because when white people occupied and conquered, they drew no distinction between the Zulus and the Swatis. In my own historical research for my book, it is so clear that the years 1878 and 1879 were the decisive years, not only for the Pedis, but for the Xhosas. It is as important as it was then that we should remain united and non-tribal in the struggle for freedom. But it is also important to remember that the foundation for the struggle was that this new way of returning what was taken would not repeat the mistakes of the colonial conquerors. And how would this happen? We come to the point that we disagree about quite a lot, about the use of the law. We know that in order for the British and the Boers to